The first total lunar eclipse since November 8, 2022 will grace Earth on the evening of March 13, 2025, and those of us in the Western Hemisphere will get very lucky because we'll be able to see the entire thing. Some in Western Africa, Western Europe, and Eastern Pacific will be able to see totality, but they'll miss either the beginning or the end depending on where they're located. And although there's another total lunar eclipse a year later in March 2026, the upcoming eclipse will be the most convenient. And after that, we'll have to wait until 2029 before we can experience another total lunar eclipse, which is quite a long wait. And in this video, I hope to share with you information that'll help you take images of the total lunar eclipse like a pro. And when it comes to lunar photography, not just lunar eclipse photography, you can use any camera. Whether it's your phone or a DSLR or a mirrorless, or an Astrocam or a planetary camera or even a point-and-shoot camera. And since the last eclipse in 2022, one thing that I've added to my arsenal are smart telescopes. So the Seastar S30 and the Dwarf 3 will get a lot of time on the eclipse. And in this video, I'll mostly focus on DSLRs, specifically Canon DSLRs, and how to automatically take images of the lunar eclipse so you can sit back, relax, maybe go inside, get a hot chocolate, and let your camera do the imaging for you. Even though the focus of this video is very narrow, don't leave, because I believe that the information I'll share with you today will be helpful for you no matter what technology you use, whether it's a phone, a DSLR, or something else. And some of those information will be exposure times, what ISO settings you may want to use, when this is happening, etc. And if you have any questions during or after the video, ask in the comments below, or check the description for a link to our Discord server where you can join and ask questions there. I'm very responsive there, and we have a growing community of astronomers and astrophotographers, and we are constantly learning from each other. Now, taking pictures of a lunar eclipse is much easier than a solar eclipse. Because first, there's no real safety concern. You don't have to worry about putting a filter on and taking it off at the exact right times. Secondly, pretty much anywhere on Earth where you can see the moon during the eclipse, you'll be able to see the eclipse. So there is no eclipse path per se, even though you have to be able to see the moon. That's the only requirement. We'll all see it at the exact same time. So me in Boston will see it at the exact same time, in quotes, as someone in Los Angeles. The only difference will be time zone. So if I see it at midnight, they'll see it at 9 p.m. And all of that combined makes lunar eclipses far more accessible to more people. So tell everyone you know, remind them to look up the evening of March 13th to the morning of March 14th. And the fourth easy thing about lunar eclipses is that totality lasts a long time. The solar eclipse from last year had about 4 minutes of totality. The lunar eclipse upcoming will be 1 hour and 5 minutes of totality. So we'll see a blood moon for quite a while. So photography opportunities are plenty from most places. So even if you have clouds now, you may not have clouds near the end of totality, and you'll be able to get that money shot. And fun fact, the longest possible lunar eclipse totality is around 1 hour and 46 minutes. So it's a really long time. So in this video, I'll show you an application called LETnC, short for Lunar Eclipse Timer and Camera Controller. So maybe it should be LETnC. This was created by Robert Neufer, who also created SetNC, which was Solar Eclipse Timer and Controller that I demoed last year, and I successfully used on 2 different setups the day of the eclipse. So huge thanks to Robert for creating another great piece of software. So the gist of LETnC is that it'll let me connect to my DSLRs using a USB cable, and it'll automate my imaging for me. So it'll determine the ISO, it'll determine the exposure settings, as well as the frequency of images. And it'll let me fine-tune whatever it's doing so that I can make it my own. The software unfortunately only works for Canon cameras. There's a compatibility list on Robert Neufer's website. And if you have a Nikon, for example, there's another application called Eclipse Orchestrator that'll work with Nikon cameras. And some of the information that I'll show you today, some of the things that I'm telling you now, will be transferable to Eclipse Orchestrator because we're all going to be shooting the same eclipse. We already started talking about the gear you need for lunar eclipse imaging, but let's talk a little bit more about what else you may need. So of course, first you need a camera. I'll be using 3 different setups. This is a Canon T2i. This is actually hydrogen alpha modded, so I'll have to fix the white balance later on. But I'll also have another Canon T2i that I use as a secondary imager, as well as a Canon T5i, which will actually be my main camera, going to my best telescope setup, if you will. And my goal is to have at least 2 of them be controlled by LETnC from 2 different machines. And if you're not letting an application like LETnC or Eclipse Orchestrator control your camera, what you'll really want is an intervalometer like this one. I bought this one, I think maybe 12 or 13 years ago, like $20, and one of the best purchases that I've made for this hobby. And what this lets you do is control the exposure time as well as the intervals between those exposures. So you can say, take 1 second exposures every 30 seconds, and it'll keep going until you tell it to stop or until it runs into the limit that you set here. So the one thing that you can't make a variable with this intervalometer is the exposure time. So if you set the exposure time to, let's say, 1 second, it'll keep taking 1 second exposures until you change it in this thing, which I think for a lunar eclipse is totally fine because you have a lot of time to make those changes. You're not rushing like a solar eclipse trying to catch Bailey's beads or prominences or the diamond ring. The next thing you'll want is some kind of optics. So you can use a camera lens, like I have this one. It's a 75 to 300 millimeter kit lens for the Canon EOS Rebel, and I've had this for a very long time. It's super handy. It fits the moon and the sun really nicely. I also use this for the solar eclipse as well. But you can also use a telescope of some kind, and the type of optics you use and the focal length you're looking at will determine how much of the moon you can really see. So the camera that I'm using here, the Canon T2i, is a crop sensor camera, which nowadays is a very common format of the sensor. But if you have an Astrocam that's a crop sensor or full sensor, the amount of moon that you can see will definitely differ based on both the sensor size as well as your optics. So let's quickly dive into Stellarium and see what the moon will look like with different optical setups, including this setup here. Here are 6 configurations showing what the moon will look like through different optics. On the top left, we have a 135mm lens. Then I have my 300mm Canon kit lens, followed by the AT60ED at 360mm. I used the last 2 configurations for the total solar eclipse last year, so I know that they work really nicely. Then I have my Ascar 71F at 490mm, then my trusty Nexstar 6SE at 1500mm, and finally the Edge HD8 at 2032mm, which is obviously too big and has been eliminated from consideration. The field of view will be different if your camera sensor is a different size, and this is an example only with a crop sensor camera. And you can use a Barlow lens to get closer to the moon with the smaller setups, but I try my best not to add extra pieces of glass in my imaging train when I can. Besides the camera, intervalometer, and lens telescope setup, other pieces of hardware that you may want to consider include a steady tripod, which will come in handy during the darker phases of the eclipse where you may need to take multi-second exposures. You can also upgrade that tripod with a tracker of some kind so that it can follow the moon. The AZ-GTI is one example. Or you can even go for a full telescope mount like a CE-M40 or a ZWO AM5, which could be considered overkill, but it'll come in handy more than you think. And if you want to use software like LETnC or Eclipse Orchestrator, you may want some kind of computer such as a mini PC or laptop. And before we go into the technical nitty-gritty of LETnC, let's talk a little bit about exposures needed for the lunar eclipse. Thanks to Mr. Eclipse himself, Fred Espenek, we have an idea of what our exposures could be, which is super helpful if you've never imaged a total lunar eclipse in the past. And this information comes in handy whether or not you're automating with LETnC or you're doing it manually using an intervalometer or even handheld. Looking at this chart from 2008, Fred Espenek breaks down the ISO and f ratio on top, and then you follow it down to the shutter speed at the bottom for the various phases. The Q value here that we see is the brightness of the moon, and the lowest value we use for our purposes today will be -7, but this chart goes down to -11. So if you were shooting at, let's say, f5.6 and ISO 200, then your longest exposure during totality would be about 15 seconds. And if you go all the way down to -11, it would go up to 4 minutes. And at this point, you'll definitely want to do some kind of tracking. In this chart, Fred Espenek recommends using one ISO setting for all of your exposures. That lets you have the noise levels between all of your images be very similar, and it also keeps the moon looking pretty similar. But I don't think it's as much of an issue with the moon as it is with the sun, especially if you're using a filter that turns the sun yellow. So ISO isn't as much of an issue. And we'll see that when we use LETnC, that LETnC recommends or actually automatically generates different ISO levels for you as well as the different exposure levels depending on where you are in the lunar eclipse cycle. And whether or not you use the same ISO or different ISOs, it's totally fine. The moon is fairly easy to image. We have a few more weeks before the total lunar eclipse happens, so you have some time to practice. And the reason that Rob Manuford gave for diverting from Fred Espenek's recommendation of using the same ISO is that it's much more helpful for people not doing any kind of tracking because you don't have to worry about the moon getting smudgy. And the exact quote he said was, "It's better to have grainy images than blurry images," and I totally agree. If you've learned anything at all in this video so far, hit the like button, And now let's us see LETnC. The first thing you want to do is download Canon EOS Utility. You can Google for this page. I'll also have the link to this in the description below. And what we're going to do is we're going to go down and we're going to find whatever camera that you're using. Since I'm using a Canon T2i, it has its own special page here. And once this loads, it's going to ask you for the operating system. So it'll automatically detect what you have. But I noticed that if I just stick with the Windows 11 or Windows 10 options, it doesn't show me what I want. And let me just quickly browse through, make sure it's not here. And it's not here. And what I'm looking for is something that says recommended that has the EOS Utility application. And the trick I found is in the version, go into Windows 8, 64X, X64. And then once that loads, there you go. So this is the file that you want. So this is the app that you want. This is Canon EOS Digital Solutions. This actually has everything that the CD would have, including the EOS Utility application. So you just click on download, and then we will download it and install it. And it asks for the serial number. And when you input the serial number of your camera, which is found at the bottom of your camera, it'll download a zip file, which I already downloaded and then extracted. And the zip file is called like KSD291A. And this is the packager. It has a bunch of other software, so I'm going to double click and install this. Into USA, Canada, United States, English. Don't do easy installation. I'm going to do custom installation. Yes. And if you did easy installation, it would have installed all of these. I don't need all of these. I don't need Digital Photo Professional. I do need EOS Utility too. This is the software I'm looking for. I don't need this. 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 This may come in handy, the lens registration tool, because it's aberration correction data to camera. So I'll leave that, but everything else is going off, and then click next. Yay, EOS Utility 2. Yes. Install. Super fast. Great. Okay. Next. No, not registering. Okay. Finish. There we go. Now we have Canon EOS Utility somewhere here. Canon Utilities, EOS Utility 2. So great. Now looking at the LETnC website, this is at robertneufers.ch website. Link is in the description. It looks very similar to the SetNC application that I reviewed last year. So check that out too if you have any upcoming solar eclipses coming up. There's also a link to it here. And we can skip all the way down to the compatibility list and see what works with it. And then we'll come back up. So there are a whole bunch of cameras that it will work for. It won't work for the 350D. So if you have that, sorry. A lot of these other ones it has been reported to work on. It goes all the way up to the EOS R6, which is fairly new. And just to give you an idea of the cameras that I'm working with the Canon EOS 550D, which is the T2i, and the 700D, which is the T5i. And this application was last updated in June 2024. So thank you, Robert, for making that update. All right, let's go back to the top and see what this looks like. So this is just a couple of screenshots that show you what the LETnC application would look like. It's a little bit less complicated than the SetNC app. And this is because there's so many more things that we don't have to worry about, such as, your location isn't as important as a solar eclipse, where the contact times and totality depend on exactly where you are. But when it comes to lunar eclipse, the shadow is on the moon itself, and pretty much everyone on Earth that can actually see the moon at that time or see the eclipse at that time will be able to see it at around the same time, accounting for time zone differences. So we'll go through the UI when we have it downloaded. There's a couple of hints to use that tell you that you need to download the EOS Utility, so the link is here too. And it says do not load EOS Utility if running LETnC. So what this means is that you need it installed, but don't make sure that it's not running. So I'll download the latest version, LETnC. All right, it's downloaded, so I'm going to click on this. It'll start installing. Yes, you want to make sure you run anyway. Click yes. Press OK. Agree, and then it'll install in program files. And there you go, it's installed. Now if I look at my start menu, I will have LETnC here. So I'm just going to right click and pin to both start, and for now it'll pinned to my taskbar as well, so I'll have it down here. Turn this on, and then we'll see what the UI looks like. So this is the UI that loads, and since it was last updated in June 2024, it defaults to opening in the partial lunar eclipse of September 18, 2024. So we just want to go, you can click and drag, or you can click on this arrow button. It'll take you to the next one, which is going to be on March 14th, 2025, Pi Day. And unlike the LETnC app, if you've seen that video, there isn't any other options here that you really need to worry about except for the time zone. So this one lets you pick non-UTC time, which is actually super helpful, especially when it comes to like demo purposes. When I'm talking to other people about it, I don't have to convert UTC time. So if you know your time zone, you can keep it on time zone. But if you want to feel like a scientist, a lot of the real astronomers will use UTC time because it's just much more easy to communicate with others. You can do that. But for the demonstration purposes, I'm going to go to UTC -5, which is my time zone in the my Eastern Standard Time at this moment. Quick reminder about daylight saving time starting on March 9th, which will affect what time zone you're in, but UTC time will not be affected. And then it automatically updated the contact times here, and there are 7 of them. So if you hover over this, there's a couple of tooltips that tells you. So this is the beginning of the penumbral eclipse, so P1. This, you'll probably not see anything. Maybe this moon will get a little bit dimmer. And then we have the umbra one, so I'm going to guess what U1 stands for, which is the beginning of the partial, there's a typo there, big eon of partial eclipse. That's okay. And this is when we'll start to see some of the shadow of Earth on the moon. And then we have Umbra 2. This is where the total eclipse begins, where the moon is almost out of view. Maybe it starts to look a little bit red. And then the maximum eclipse, this is going to be like this as far away from of the full moon as possible at this point. And then we have Umbra 3, which is the end of the total eclipse. Umbra 4, which is the end of the partial eclipse. And then P4, which is the end of the penumbral eclipse. And you can see from the time, it goes from my local time from 10:55 p.m. all the way to 5:01 a.m. So this is a long event, and the totality of the lunar eclipse is over an hour. So this is very different from a solar eclipse. This is much easier to do. You don't need special software to help you do this, but if you want to automate things, this is definitely the way to go. And of course there's a countdown, so at the moment of this recording I have 33 days until, or almost 34 days until the eclipse begins. Great. So this is the first view. Next thing we want to do is we want to click on, not file, but camera. Once you click on camera, we have this other window that opened up here. So at this point is where you want to connect your USB cable to your camera, and I'm just plugging mine in now and clicking on. And again, you don't want to turn on EOS utility, so you can see that it detected my T2i here. I don't want EOS utility running, and once that's done, I click on connect camera, and there you go, it has connected. So I disconnected the camera, and I will connect it again just so you see what it looks like. So I'll click on connect, and now on the screen you can see that the camera kind of came online, or it came up. So you can see that on this screen I can control the camera from my computer. So my image quality, you can see it's using JPEG, so I can switch it to RAW. The ISO speed is set to auto, so if you look on the screen, I can set it to 6400. It updates on the screen automatically. 3200. And I can switch the time value, or the TV value. Now it's at 1/4000th of a second, but I can set it to like 1/200th of a second, 1/13th of a second. And I can click on release, and you heard it take a picture. This just shows you that we can control the camera directly from our computer. And this lets us programmatically define exactly when the camera should take a picture, what settings it should use in order for us to take amazing eclipse photography. Looking at some of the other tabs, you can also go to the advanced camera tests. We can take some test pictures. So I'll click on this. You'll see that it'll take a couple of pictures really fast, and it gives you a little bit of an idea of what the timing is like, because older cameras tend to take longer with their shutters. So this will give you an idea of, like, if you're trying to take burst images, this will give you an idea of like how long it'll actually take. Even if you take images at 1/4000th of a second, you're not going to be able to take 4,000 frames in a second. Normally you wouldn't really have any need to really do these advanced camera tests anyway. There's also this eclipse photography, so we'll come back to this later on, but this is where you'll actually come and then click on start eclipse photography once you have your exposure tables set, and it'll run through here. These will update. Once you have your exposure table set, you can also do test eclipse photography, where it'll run through all of your rows that we'll look at soon. But for now, we're going to, on the main window here, we're going to click on exposure tables. And now we get another window here that says LETnC exposure table. So now this is pretty cool. This is what will generate a table for you that the camera will then follow. Going from left to right, the camera default setting, these are exactly pretty much what we saw in the window down here in the interactive camera test here. And you want to make sure that you put raw. At least you want to take raw images. If you have space in your SD card, you know you're not taking a lot of images, you can do raw plus JPEG. It probably makes it a little bit easier to follow or to share on social media, so you could do that as well. Now the AE, ISO, and the F numbers here are grayed out because we can't change them. So we'll see that the ISO speed is programmatically set in the table here later on. So we'll come back to that. In the middle, we have the basic interval. So instead of using intervalometer, we're going to use LETnC, and this will be your intervalometer. And we can generate a table based on these intervals. So we have 15 seconds all the way to 10 minutes. Again, lunar eclipses are very long. You don't want to take a billion pictures and have a billion pictures to process. So you might want to do one every 5 or 10 minutes. I'll probably do one every minute. I'll probably do a bracketed exposure. I'll show you what I mean when the exposure table is created. But if you don't want to be crazy, you can do 10 minutes. And this isn't set in stone. So even if it says 15 seconds, this is just to generate the table. You can change those later on yourself. Now on the right here, it says the manual F number setting has priority over camera setting. So if I uncheck this, you'll see that the ISO speed and the F number here becomes available. And the reason the F number is currently gray is because I don't have a lens connected to this, so the camera can't actually read any kind of F ratio coming from a lens. So this is still blank. The one reason you want to click this on is if you're using a camera or if you're using a telescope that has no way to manually control the aperture. You can come in here and put in the F ratio of your telescope here. You may also need to do this if you're using a manual lens where, sure, you can control the F ratio manually, but there's no way to automatically do it. So you want to set this here. So the telescope I'll be using will be an f6.9. It's going to be my Ascar 71F. At the making of this video, I might change my mind later on. And it's going to use this value in order to create the exposure tables. So we'll click create exposure table, and this is what it looks like. So this looks like just like an Excel spreadsheet, right? That's pretty much what it is. And you can actually click on file, you can save exposure table as, and you can save it as a CSV file, open it in Excel, make changes, and then bring it back here as open exposure table where you can browse through your computer, and it'll work just like as you see. Now breaking down the table here, there's a lot of useful information. On the left hand side, we have a .wav file, a wave file. So you can actually have a location here of a sound for some reason. With the solar eclipses, it makes sense when you want to announce your totality and when to remove and take off filters. We don't have that with the lunar eclipse. Now I'll go over what these values mean soon, but we're going to skip this column for now and go into the date time. So again, it uses the UTC -5 time zone as I selected in the main window, and this is based on that time zone. Pretty self-explanatory. Image quality is, again, this is what we selected here. So if I want to go back to just raw, I'll click on this, I'll click on create exposure table, and it overrides it, right? So that's one way to do it. But the one thing to know is that every time you click on create exposure table, it's going to set defaults to whatever you select here. So if you come in here and you change the ISO from, let's say, 400 to 1600, and then I click on create exposure table, you see that it overrides. So something to keep in mind. And another reason to use the save exposure table as functionality. And then we also kind of briefly just covered the ISO, the ASA. This is the ISO settings here. You can see that it gets higher and higher as the moon gets darker and darker, and it goes up to 1600 based on my F ratio here. And the next column, it has the actual F ratio. We don't have to put anything here because LETnC won't be able to control a telescope's F ratio anyway. But if you had a lens that let you control the F ratio programmatically or electronically through the camera, you can put that here. You can make changes here. Now these options here are the exposure settings, right? So it goes up down from as fast as 1/8,000th of a second to 8 seconds. Now, a lot of cameras, especially the older ones, will not be able to do 1/8,000th of a second. So This is here for the newer cameras. My camera can't do anything faster than 1/4000th of a second. So for my setup, LETnC decided that for the first phase of the lunar eclipse is going to take a bunch of 1/2000th of a second shot every 10 minutes. And then it'll take two 1/1000th of a second, and then 1/500th of a second, 1/250th of a second, until we hit totality, which is here, where it's going to set the ISO to ISO 1600, and it'll take 4-second exposures every 10 minutes for 6 times, right? 7 times, so 70 minutes of totality, and then it'll go back down until it goes all the way here. Now this can get crazy. So if you start doing 15-second exposures, so let me show you what that looks like. You can see that there's a ton more rows that get created here. It bounces back and forth, and then totality, it just gets a lot more experimental. You can see there's a lot more totality pictures here. So this is where you get the blood moon. There we go. So yeah, so that has 1469 rows as opposed to 41 rows. So something to keep in mind if you don't have a lot of space on your memory card. And then I briefly mentioned bracketed shots. So what that means is that even though this has selected 1/2000th of a second at 2238, I can actually put an X here and an X here. And what this will do is at 2238 or 10:38 p.m., it'll actually take 3 images from me: 1/2000th of a second, 1/1000th of a second, and 1/500th of a second, which is pretty cool, right? So you can do all of these if you want, because if you're doing them every 10 minutes, you have a lot of time to get through these. So you can do a lot of bracketed shots. And when we did the solar eclipse, I had going from 1/4000th of a second all the way to I think half a second, and then more so. So watch that video if you want to learn more about that. And then another reminder is that once you make customizations, you want to save this as something. Otherwise, when you click on create exposure table, it overrides. Now let's quickly go over what these numbers mean. So I'm going to open up the Robert Newfer's website again, and there is a legend here that tells us exactly what these are. So I'm going to go all the way down. So there we go. The first number here goes from -3 to 4, but defaults to 0. So 0 means there's no eclipse, it's just a full moon. So we take a couple of images as the full moon, because why not? And then the -1 is for the penumbral eclipse and before maximum eclipse. -2 is partial eclipse before the maximum eclipse. So these are just the phase numbers. -3 is when total eclipse begins. And then 4 is when it's at supermax eclipse. So this is at its deepest eclipse. So for this particular lunar eclipse, it'll be at 1:58 a.m. And then we start going up. So 3 is total eclipse ends, and then partial eclipse, and then 1, and then back to 0, which is just we're taking a final picture of the full moon at 5:18 a.m. Next thing we have the number. So the number is just a sequential number. So like 0, we took 2 of those images. So that's what it is. -1, there's going to be 7 or 8. -2, there'll be 7, so on and so forth. And this is just counting the number of frames for that progress level. Next, we have the deep. So this is a percentage. So like 0.000 means it's at 0% eclipsed. 0.041, it's going to be 4% eclipsed, and it keeps going until it hits 1.000, which is 100% eclipsed. And then it goes down all the way back down to 0. That's pretty self-explanatory. It's just percentages as displayed in decimals. And finally is the Q, which is the brightness level. So this is pretty interesting. Higher the number, the brighter the object is, and -7 seems to be the lowest object. And for this, I'm going to go back to this page. If we scroll up, there's some information that Robert Newfer has gathered from Fred Espenek, who is a legend when it comes to eclipses. And looking at these two charts here, we can see what the Q is for the partial eclipse. This is just a brightness value. And this chart here very, very clearly demonstrates what the Q value is. So it starts at 8 and goes all the way down to -8, but the totality goes up to -7, where we have the penumbral eclipse, and then totality is around 3, and then the mid eclipse, where we have totality, is at -7, and it keeps going back up. And totality here, as defined, is that it is set to a constant of -7. So we start there and the full moon brightness is set to Q of 8. So everything in between is just computed to be at these different levels. It's a really interesting calculation. I don't think we have to really go too deep into what the numbers really mean. It's just that 8 is the brightest and -7 is totality. So this is what it looks like. So again, you can take this into Excel, make changes, and put it back here. All right, let's say that we are here and it is time to start your camera for the eclipse. So you have this open. You want to make sure that your exposure table is open. And then if you go into Eclipse Photography, we can click on Start Eclipse Photography. And what this did is it started the countdown timers, right? So right now I have 33 days, 22 hours, 8 minutes left. So it's actually not going to do anything for 33 days. Using the Start Eclipse Photography option is kind of useless, but we still want to practice, and that's where the Test Eclipse Photography comes into play. There's this button here that says Advanced Time, but it gives you a warning that if you advance time, it sets the program into rehearsal time mode, which is the same as the Test Eclipse Photography mode. So if I click on Advanced Time, listen, you'll see that it's counting down to 5 and watch. There you go. It took a picture, and now it's waiting 10 minutes because it's pretending like we are currently on March 13th at 22:48, and I can click on Advanced Time. So this is another really good way of testing your exposure table to make sure it works as you're expecting it. I'm going to do it one more time. Voila. So it took those 3 pictures, and it tells you exactly what the exposure was, what the image was, what the ISO was, what the exposure was, etc. And then it gives you the date and time of the next operation, so you know exactly what is going to get triggered. So it's going to be 23:08, so we know that those first 3 rows are done, and it's going to be on row number 4. If we can go back to real time, and it'll put us back into this, right? So I can click on abort. So that's practice time. If you still want to test to make sure, you want to quickly go through all of these to make sure your camera doesn't stall anywhere, you're not messing up. So I think this is where I can put an X here and see what it looks like. And I'm going to click on Test Eclipse Photography. Let's see. And you can hear the camera going. It's taking these pictures in sequence. It's not waiting more than a second for any of these. And this is just a great way of making sure that your camera can take all of these exposures. And you can see it's at totality is doing 4 seconds. And I'll click on abort. There we go. So now we are actually fully ready to go out into the field, find the moon, track the moon, connect it to a computer. So this is on my mini PC, so it's already portable. And then just turn it on and then forget about it. Now let's quickly go over how we can modify this table and fine-tune our changes. So we have all of these. Let's say you have, these 41 rows, but you want to take 3 more images like here. So how do you add a new row? So it's not really intuitive. So all you need to do is on the row header here, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right click, and then you get some more options here, such as insert before, insert after, delete line, and done. So if you click on insert before, you'll get almost a blank line, so you'd want to copy one of these over. It copies the current time to whatever it was, and then the image quality, you just want to make sure that it's one of these, so you want to copy and paste instead of typing it in, just so you don't run into any typos, or I think it's case sensitive as well, so you want to make sure that it's perfectly exact. And when it comes to the timing, this is sequential. So you want to make sure that if you're adding a new row, here since it's 23:28, you don't want to put 23:58 because that's here. If this runs, it'll end up running into errors or cause unforeseen issues down the line when you're actually trying to take pictures. So you don't want to risk it. You want to make sure that they're sequential. So I'll just click copy and paste. Here I can do, ISO 800. I can do whatever I want, and then I can do X, X, X. And then when I'm done, I click on done. And let's say I don't want this column here, I can click on this. If I do delete on my keyboard, you'll see that it deletes the row, but it deletes all the data in the row, but not the data itself, or not the row itself. So I can right click here and I can click on delete line, and it deletes that line for me. Same thing with insert after, self-explanatory. So that's really one quick way to do it just here in the UI. And then the other way you can do it is you need to save this as, or export this as something. You can save exposure table. It saves it as a default file, but I like doing it as export as. Here, I'm just going to do a test. So I'll do like test table v1.csv. You can do csv or .txt, and it'll give you a comma separated file anyway. You click on OK. I'm doing it as CSV because I think it's a little bit easier to read. So I open this up. So I have my test table here. So I can right click. I'll open this with Notepad instead of Excel. And then when you open it here, you get these values here. We kind of briefly saw this already, where I can put like, like X, 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 and then I can make edits here. I can change the ISO here. So like this will be 800. And then I'll click Control S or File, Save, and I can re-import it. Before I close out of this, I want to point out the 35. So 35 is the Eclipse number in LETnC. So here, if I switch this from 314 to the next one is 907, this one's going to be 36. So you want to make sure that when you edit this spreadsheet or this file, you want to make sure that the 35 stays. If you're doing 36 later on, you want to make sure the 36 stays. Don't overwrite that value. So this is done, and I'm going to go into LETnC, my exposure table, click on File, Open Exposure Table, open this, and you saw that now this row here, which I edited, has now been added ISO 800 and all of these X's. Great. And if you like using spreadsheets like Google Spreadsheets, you can actually take the CSV files that you created, take them into Google Sheets or Excel, manipulate it, and then copy and paste them back. So one example here is that, so I have this Google Sheet here. I added a bunch of rows. You can see I just made a bunch of rows. I just copied and pasted this ISO 1600 rows and added an ISO 400 row in case, you just want to keep ISO 400 everywhere. So we can't export the CSV from Google Sheets or Excel and then import them using Open Exposure Table just because of how they save their files and the format that LETnC needs. So the trick to do it here is to, if you just look on your Google Sheets, look at how many rows you have. So I have 53 rows, even though it's 54, because we're not counting the first one. So we're going to make sure that there's 53 rows. It doesn't matter where you put them because we're going to override them. So I'm just going to right click there and then do insert after. 54. So I'm just going to delete one. And then now I'm going to go to I'm going to select all of my cells with data. I'll do Control C to copy, go back to my exposure table, make sure I am in make sure I'm in phase 1, this cell here, and then press Control V, and you can see that it overrode all of this. It has my new custom rows, it's filled all the way to 53, has all of the X's that I put. So it's a little bit of a weird workflow where you have to copy and paste, but this is a really great way especially if you're adept with Google Sheets here, that you can make those manipulations. And one last thing I want to show you is, if you are familiar with Excel, you can make some Excel-like adjustments here. Like for example, like I did ISO 800, but what if I want the rest of these to be ISO 800? If you look here, there's a square dot at the bottom right side. You just click and drag, and it actually autofills. So you can see that they all became X. I can do the same thing with these here as well. I can select multiple, and then autofill down. And now they all have X. So it's a really fun way and quick way to do massive data manipulation here pretty easily. If you have any questions about any of this, please do let me know. Don't get stuck on the Excel Google Sheets part. Just make things manually if you need to. If you stuck around this far, I want to thank you for spending all your time with me. I know this was a really long video, but I wanted to get all of this information out now because we don't have a lot of time before the lunar eclipse. And if you take images of the lunar eclipse, please join our Discord server and share your photos with us. Good luck. Remember to look up, and clear skies.